I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be talking about the Iran war and the Israel lobby with Ian Lustick and the Quincy Institute's Eli Clifton. They recently penned an article together entitled How the Israeli Tail Wags the American Dog for The Nation magazine, and they have a book coming out called Israel's Lobby, America in the Grip of a Foreign Power. We'll be discussing aspects of that book as well as the aforementioned article on this edition of Parallax Views. But before we get to that, I'd like to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener-funded with the exception of my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of WallStreetWindow.com. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's Wall Street Window, where you can get the best financial and trading news. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So if you can, head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, sign up for the newsletter, and I believe if you do that, you can also get a copy of Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Once again, that's wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Ian Lustick and Eli Clifton. Welcome back to Parallax Views. Two guests that I'm very, very happy to have back on the show that I've had on the show multiple times, actually, both of them. Eli Clifton is senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and the investigative journalist at large at Responsible Statecraft, longtime friend of the show. And joining him with us is Ian S. Lustick, professor emeritus of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. And, you know, Ian is no stranger to the show. A lot of us have really dug into his work on the one state reality and that paradigm. We're going to be discussing the Israel lobby with Eli and Ian, and they have a new book coming out. I don't believe it's out yet, but it should be coming out. Israel's Lobby, America in the Grip of a Foreign Power. And before that book comes out, people can read their article at The Nation, How the Israeli Tail Wags the American Dog. How are you both doing? And did I get everything right there with the intro?
Yes, you did, JG. Very good.
So I guess where I want to start, if it's okay, Ian, I wanted to ask you first, since you've been around a long time dealing with these issues. We talked in the past about how you were one of the early supporters of a two-state solution, and how at that time, and I believe the 70s, people said, oh, that's crazy, that's anti-Semitic.
Yes.
How dare you? So you've been in this a long time. When did you start noticing the influence of the Israel lobby?
Well, I'd say in the early 70s. I came back from Israel in 1969 as an undergraduate, determined to make a career of studying political science in a way that would allow me to be an expert on both Palestine and Israel and teach on both sides. When I was at Berkeley as a graduate student, I was part of a left-wing Zionist organization that supported a two-state solution, but they largely did it because of my arguments, because there were only 1,100 settlers in the West Bank at that time. 1,100. They're now over the Green Line, about 900,000. And I said, this is the end of the Jewish democratic state, because they're not going to be able to get the settlers out of there. You've got to have a two-state solution right away, a non-belligerent Palestinian state. And we had a small group that had a petition. Only Jews were to be talked to about this. We didn't want to go to the Gentile media. We were trying to be loyal to the Jewish community. But we got about 400 signatures, and we made a little bit of an impact. But the main thing that happened was wherever we went, we were attacked as anti-Semites. And as Nazis, even, I was personally attacked. Uh, and of course, as you mentioned, now that starting around the early aughts, I started to realize that a negotiated two-state solution was no longer at all plausible and was actually the pursuit of it was damaging the futures of both peoples. And I switched to the idea of a one-state reality. And I'm now being condemned by people who adopted the idea I supported 40 years ago because as an anti-Semite, because I am no longer supporting the two-state solution. So I've been used to this for quite a long time, and Eli and I are not really bothered too much by the fact that we will be accused of anti-Semitism. That just goes with the territory here.
Just to follow up on something, Ian, now the one state reality, I've always understood that to be different than saying you support a one state solution. So have you changed your mind on that as well? Do you support a one state or what?
Let me be very as clear as possible. This turned out to be quite a difficult concept for people. A solution as an algebra is not the picture of the equation at the end with no x's or y's. That's not the solution. The solution is how you get there, how you use algebraic strategies to get from x's and y's to a solution. If I think about a two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, that's a pretty picture of the future. I have many pretty pictures of the future. I have a confederation of Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. How about a cantonal system for the whole country? What about a federation of all Middle Eastern states? All of these are very pretty pictures. How about one state where everybody's an equal citizen? Another pretty picture. It's not a solution unless I know of a plausible political path from where we are now to there. And I used to have such a path to get to the two-state pretty picture. That was gone as a result of de facto annexation transformations in Israel. So I don't have a solution anymore in that sense. I have pretty pictures, and I have a one-state reality. That is, there's one and only one government that determines what buildings are allowed to stand at what time between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That's a one-state reality. Different peoples, they're not peoples who live there are not equal, but that's not unusual in a state. How do you deal with that reality instead of dealing with the assumption that there's one state and then these territories that aren't part of it that might be available for something else?
Now, Eli, I want to move on to you. I want to open this conversation up with explaining what the Israel lobby is. And I know that may sound like a very basic question, but I do think there's a problem where people will either treat the Israel lobby as just being AIPAC or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or there will be people that want to downplay AIPAC and act as if it's just Christians United for Israel or evangelical Christians. But really, the Israel lobby is an assortment of pro-Israel affinity groups making up a bigger lobbying effort.
That's right. It's certainly a group of organizations, institutions, and I believe increasingly of importance, individuals who are seeking to advance Israel's interests and secure U.S. policies that are beneficial to Israel's right-wing government and consistent with the pursuits of Israel's right-wing governments. Now, when you talk about the different interpretations of why people may have a more expansive, more limited definition of what that lobby is, I think that very often comes with sort of some loaded or political agendas attached to it. You know, one easy way and one way we expect to be attacked is for some folks who are very often parts of this lobby to say that any attack on the so-called or criticism of so-called Israel's lobby is simply referring to all Jewish Americans. And, you know, that's just factually incorrect. You know, the vast majority of Jewish Americans, when you talk about the salience of issues that they vote on, it's like in ninth place when they vote is Israel. That's not flipping any votes. Jewish Americans are not a swing vote in the United States compared to any other ethnic or religious group. They're one of the most stable groups that vote consistently Democratic. Some portion of them vote for Republicans, but the number doesn't really change. So it is, in our view, yes, it is a group of individuals and a group of institutions. And when I say I want to emphasize the individuals, post Citizens United in 2010 and the Speech Now decision that followed shortly thereafter, it opened the floodgates for plutocrats in our elections. And that coincided with what has been a steady and in the past few years since October 7th, an accelerating decrease in public support for Israel and greater sympathies for the Palestinians. There's no evidence of that trend changing. So this evaporating grassroots support for these status quo policies of aid for Israel, political cover in international forum like at the United Nations or at the ICC in the case of the pursuit of arrest warrants for Israelis such as Benjamin Netanyahu. There has been that's been balanced out by the campaign contributions that have gone to politicians like Donald Trump or to Joe Biden, who have consistently continued to pursue these policies that are increasingly at odds with what their voters have wanted and express in polling. And that massive delta between where public opinion is and where policy is, I think, can only be explained by this targeted enormous sums of money that have entered into our campaign finance system and have made the election of these politicians possible.
Can we delve deeper into that? Because so you said you see that as the only explanation. I know there's going to be people that'll push back and say, well, the American the American blob or the establishment, the deep state, they seem to really like war, military adventurism. We're a country that has been doing that for years. So I think people will say, well, isn't some of this just a continuation of sort of imperial ambitions that the U.S. has had and not just AIPAC? How would you respond?
I think that's certainly a legitimate point to make, and I want to bring Ian in on that as well in just a moment. I would just point out, though, that these small group of donors that we talk about in this book, who, through their own words, state that advancing in Israel's interests is sort of first and foremost in their motivations for their political engagement, they don't just give to politicians. They give to many of these institutions that you've referred to derisively, justified or not, as the blob. So they are financing this echo chamber. Now, whether these people whose salaries are being paid by this are true believers or not, that's something that I wouldn't want to speculate on what goes on inside someone's head. What I can say is there's a pattern here of that the money is going both to politicians as well as to think tanks and advocacy groups who are all advocating for the same policies.
And my take on it is, number one, that I wouldn't agree with that analysis of the blob. Yes, there are some in the establishment who would, the neocons, for example, who were well-connected, who were looking for opportunities to destroy monsters abroad and establish an American benevolent world empire. But for the most part, the military intelligence establishment is resistant to the overuse of American power and has learned the lessons more deeply than most politicians of just how stupid and destructive American military interventions abroad usually are.
They've come to see how soft power can work even better than hard power.
That's true too. But what I would point out, so I'll point out two things. One is what keeps pushing presidents, like even a president who comes into power saying, I'm against these forever wars, what keeps pushing them into it is the vast preponderance of American military power. We have this huge hammer that can break anything in the world at any time a president wants it. And when a president is constrained domestically, as he is by our Constitution, our Madisonian system, the temptation to use all that power to solve a problem dramatically in a way that you're not constrained against by countervailing forces is overwhelming. And you're always faced, whether you're Carter or Clinton or Obama or Trump, with the idea that if I don't do it, I'll be told later that I could have done it and I could have solved a problem which now is even bigger. So there's that structural problem. But what I would point out in this context is something we mentioned in the book. There are two issues in world politics that for decades the United States has been three standard deviations away from the rest of the world. What are those two? One is Israel. The world is over here, whether the UN Security Council resolutions or anything else, on settlements, on Israeli policies, on Gaza. And the United States is over here vetoing everything. What's the other issue that's like that? Cuba. Okay? And in the Cuba case, the United States votes against the entire world every year to continue an embargo and boycott of Cuba, a boycott which we oppose when it applies to Israel. Israel is the only other country that votes with us for the boycott. Okay, so there's absolutely the opposite substantive position. How do you explain why on those two issues the United States is three standard deviations away? Because those are the two issues where there's a powerful domestic lobby. So a foreign policy issue that is usually of no electoral importance becomes crucial to a president and to Congress because of the domestic political lobby, the Cuban lobby, and even more powerful Israel lobby. That's the actual explanation historically.
Another thing I want to get into, and maybe you can tackle this, Eli, and Ian, you can also add your thoughts as well as, people will say to me, well, it's because of the close relationship that Israel and the U.S. have with each other, and we share intel, and I'm like, I don't really buy this anymore. I feel like it's something that people just say, that we have like this shared interest. And I think our interests diverge a lot. And I think people like John Hoffman at the Cato Institute have pretty thoroughly shown that there is a case that, U.S. and Israeli interests are not in alignment a lot of times. Do you want to speak to that, Eli?
I mean, I think that what's so fascinating is that it's self-evident, right? That, two countries, different regions, 6,000 miles apart, are going to inherently have different interests. It's rather absurd to claim that they would be the same. And that's something that even, then candidate for, as part of he was Donald Trump's running mate at the time, J.D. Vance made this very point that, obviously he stated, because this is an obvious, self-evident fact that Israeli and American interests would diverge at various points, and we should be honest about with one another when that occurs. But there is an enormous amount of work, and I would once again argue an enormous amount of money that goes into trying to persuade people, often just through the sheer repetition of the claim, that Israeli and American interests are truly synonymous. As for the intelligence sharing, sure, I'm sure it goes on and continues to. But as we've just seen with the decision to strike Iran, there's ample evidence that the Israelis, exactly through that very close relationship with the United States, used it to persuade Donald Trump that this was a good idea, that this was an easily winnable war, and that the goals that he was trying to pursue in it, of some sort of notion of either a vastly weakened Iran or complete regime change, could be easily achieved quickly. So yes, it is a close relationship, but the idea that means it is inherently synonymous with our interests or it's somehow good for us. The same argument can run the opposite way as well, which is it can be used to manipulate the United States. It can be used to manipulate American presidents. It can be used to persuade them that they should do things that they themselves may not want to do.
Real quick, what I was going to add to that was I think it's been clear that a lot of administrations post George W. Bush have been wanting to pivot out of the Middle East, and yet we get brought back in constantly. And to me, that's the elephant in the room with this portion of the conversation we're having.
Well, I'd like to throw in something on this. You mentioned I've been around a long time, so I can remember back in the 70s and 80s during the Cold War when the lobby and its supporters would argue the idea that Israel's interests are American interests. They are our main ally against the Soviet Union in the Middle East, helping to stop expansionism, helping to stop Soviet-supported terror. This was this, and that the money we were giving Israel was a bargain. In fact, one book called it a $36 billion bargain because it was like a land-based aircraft carrier. Well, what I've always found instructive is that when you look at the aid levels that the United States gave to Israel, they were about a little over $3 billion in the late 80s. Then the Soviet Union, this great enemy, collapsed. and disappeared, and the Cold War ended. And what happened to the aid we gave to Israel, which was supposedly justified by the role they were playing? It didn't change at all. It continued almost exactly the same amount year after year. Why? Because the level of military and economic aid never had anything to do with the strategic role. It had to do with with the lobby's ability to get what it wanted out of Congress and out of the president. So that straight lining, that graph shows just about everything you would need to know to debunk that argument.
There's one other piece here, and I'd love to. I know Ian has quite a bit to say about it, and I'd love to hear him get into it, which is, there is a little bit of a slight twist on that argument that gets made, which is that by maintaining these close ties with Israel, by supplying this level of aid, by engaging presumably in the intelligence sharing that goes on, it gives the United States some degree of influence over Israel's behavior and actions. Ian, could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Well, theoretically, it does. And George Bush the first, did exercise considerable influence by denying the loan guarantees, just making a very small statement. We are not going to pay for settlements through loan guarantees that are over the green line. And this created an explosion of opposition to George Bush. It did succeed in producing a labor government in 1991 that went ahead and did some kind of negotiations with the PLO, opening up at least the possibility of peace. But George Bush himself could not withstand the pressure of the lobby. He had to back away from that. And he lost his election in part because Clinton was fully supported by the lobby and actually followed their lead, backed away from any strategy of pressuring Israel to make some kind of reasonable deal. And the result, partly the result of that, was the collapse of Oslo, the last best hope of the two-state solution. So yes, we have had that leverage if we wanted to exercise it, but whether it was what we show in the book is whether it was Carter, Nixon, whether it was Ford, whether it was Obama, whether it was Bush, even Reagan, when they went toward a policy that they preferred, which is to put a little pressure on Israel toward some kind of Palestinian or comprehensive solution, they were always forced, always constrained, always persuaded by their domestic political advisors to stop because it was going to be too expensive for them politically.
I wanted to ask both of you about Marco Rubio's comments recently saying that, the reason we're in this Iran war is because Israel was going to do this preemptively. So we just got into it because they were ready to attack. So I don't even understand what he means by that other than, well, Israel was going to attack. So we went in.
Well, I think he deserves a lot of credit. I mean, at least the first part of what he said was a very clear, concise summary of the problem, which is that they believed that Israel, this country that is our number one recipient of aid, that we maintain these close intelligence sharing relationships with, that supposedly, we are told has shared interests with us, was about to do something that we were unable to stop them from doing, and that was going to quite inevitably result in retaliation against the United States because we are perceived as being the enabler of their actions and behaviors. Now, the second part of his statement, which is so we decided that we were going to go get ahead of this and do it ourselves, is kind of where it's sort of hard to keep following the train of reasoning because it seems as if the solution should have been to try to do whatever one could to use whatever leverage we have to make them not do this thing that was going to be enormously harmful to U.S. national security interests and to allies in the region, I might add, like UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, who are all experiencing this war. But I thought it was extremely honest of Marco Rubio. Ian?
I thought it was so amusing. I mean, I have to say, when I first heard it, I started laughing. I didn't laugh because it wasn't true. I laughed because I remember the 1956 Suez War, in which the British and French had a secret deal with the Israelis that Israel would attack Sinai, and the British and French would say, "Oh my, the Suez Canal is in danger because the Israelis are attacking. We have to invade Egypt and protect the canal," which they did, and it was a disaster for everybody. But so what you have is the actual thing behind the scenes, and then this crazy story that nobody believes, which is, oh no, we have to act because the Israelis are acting. And here is Rubio. In this case, the truth is he's got a president who comes up with these crazy ideas and he has to justify them somehow. And so he reaches for this old kind of argument that the British and French used, that the Israelis made us do it, when it's really Trump under the aegis of Netanyahu that's forcing him to come up with some kind of rationale. So I just found it, yes, as we say, the quiet part, he said out loud a little bit, but it's also just, from an historical point of view, utterly amusing.
Do both of you want to talk a little bit about Netanyahu's comments over the years? Because he sort of makes hay out of, oh, I know how to move the Americans into the directions they need to go. Like he's sort of open about saying, well, I can manipulate these Americans into doing what I want. Do you want to speak to that? And do you think it says anything about how close the lobby is to, I guess, Likud elements, or the Likud party?
One of the things that we show in the book is that the lobby has indeed moved way to the right over time. And closer and closer to the Likud line. Netanyahu, of course, represents that. He's been the leader of the Likud since the 90s, the longest-serving prime minister. But we also have in the book a quote from a clip that shows Netanyahu in one of the rare times when he was out of office in 2000, I think, and he was speaking to activists and was being videotaped in Israel, in Hebrew, and he asked the videotaper to turn off the videotape, and they didn't do it, but he thought they had turned it off. So he went on to say what his strategy would be toward the Palestinians would be basically to pulverize them. And when asked by his interlocutors, well, wait a minute, will the United States, the world, let us do that? Oh, he said, the United States, America is a thing I know very well, very easy to move. They won't get in our way. They won't bother us. So that is something that we see. We have evidence from the lobby insiders themselves have the same self-portrayal that they are in control of this policy. That's how they raise money. Hot mic moments and let's say unwise from a political point of view, frank candidness by some of the operatives inside of AIPAC, plus some AIPAC operatives who got dissatisfied and left the organization have spoken openly about the way the operation is seen.
MJ Rosenberg comes to mind.
Not Steve Rosen. And one of the interesting things about Steve Rosen is that he was fired by AIPAC and for something that he says they had been honoring and paying him to do for years. And so he countersued. He sued AIPAC, and in the process of suing them, released all this information that shows just how true his comments were. That is, he was being paid to manipulate and to spy on the United States.
I think that, as I was saying earlier in this conversation, that things have changed a bit as positive sentiments for Israel have declined with the American public, and this flood of money has come in to replace that. And I think you're seeing more and more moments where, people like Norm Coleman, the chairman of the Republican Jewish Coalition, or mega donors like the Adelsons, Sheldon or Miriam, have both made comments, or even Donald Trump when he talks about the influence of, effectively these mega donors, but more broadly what we would call Israel's lobby, um, are talking about what they do in a more forthright manner, um, partially, I think, because they don't care about how it is perceived, because this is not anymore about persuasion so much as the exercise of raw power within our political system through mechanisms that have been made legal. And when they talk like this, they are probably talking like pretty much every other, special interest that may be working against broader public opinion, but they figure that their targeted interest in it, their targeted money against issues that may not be of high salience for most voters, is something where they will simply be able to push their issue through. And I think that that blunt way of speaking is something that, it used to be sort of a hot mic moment. It used to be something that would come out as, something that people would, have accidentally said, or something that it would take a whistleblower to come out and say. And more, we are seeing it being said in those blunt terms in the open. And I think it's kind of worth interrogating what has changed that has led us to that point. And I don't really accept that the interests or the policies being pursued by the lobby have somehow changed that much, so much as their ways of holding and influencing policy and policymakers have changed a bit over time. And that ability to flex muscle and show that they have power and influence, if anything, it becomes a necessity in their ability to hold the levels of influence that they want to be able to retain.
Real quick, Ian, because I think it may have confused listeners. I was thinking you were going to mention MJ Rosenberg, who's an American
Oh, MJ
commentator that used
Rosenberg,
to
yes.
work for
Yeah.
AIPAC. You mentioned Stephen Rosen, though. That was Stephen Rosen and I think Keith Weissman, who were
Yes, yes.
indicted for espionage, or they took classified information.
They were for passing classified information to the Israelis, and Keith Weissman, along with M.J. Rosenberg and Douglas Bloomfield, these are activists in AIPAC who defected or who saw. Weissman, for example, has spoken about, look, this was always a bad idea, and but Rosen is an example of somebody who was a real loyalist, just furious at AIPAC for selling him down the river. And in the process of then suing AIPAC, he revealed in all this open court testimony the dynamics and the ordinary language within AIPAC. But M.J. Rosenberg is one of those people who was an early activist in AIPAC, relatively early, and who has said and testified in many ways about with inside information about what AIPAC did. For example, he was with his help or things he's put on record, able to document the theory, the program that AIPAC had in setting up the Washington Institute for Near East Policy as a think tank that would be used as the source of talking heads for the American media, but would be guided by the Israel lobby and controlled by it, essentially.
Now, one thing I wanted to talk about was maybe previous ways in which Netanyahu or pro-Israel affinity groups have pushed for war in the past. I know in the article you both wrote together, you talk about Netanyahu's visit to Congress in 2002, and I think there were elements of the lobby that really pushed for the Iraq War as well.
Yeah, and to be very clear, to narrow it down a little bit, AIPAC has lied about their role in trying to promote the Iraq War. Their Hill briefing book, which they had, they now deleted, but it was circulating, and I have a copy of it from roughly 2001, 2002, very clearly made the case for regime change in Iraq, very much made the case that to not take military action against Saddam Hussein was going to lead to certainly the proliferations of weapons of mass destruction. This were very much things that they were saying. Again, this was supposed to be behind closed doors when they spoke to congressional offices, when they spoke to the foreign policy legislative assistants for members who might be voting on these matters. This was not something that was supposed to be public, but it very much was, as it turns out, and they have lied about it over the years. Other groups like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies have scrubbed their websites of articles that they had published that were, as well as their own institutional positions about the war in Iraq. And again, once again, warning about the weapons of mass destruction that simply did not exist. So yeah, I mean, you go through the list here. The American Enterprise Institute played a huge role in that as well. Um, a lot of these groups were very active, both behind the scenes and publicly. Some have worked to try to cover their tracks, others have not. But the thing that frankly kind of brought me to this topic was, being a journalist in Washington in the early 2000s and reporting on the think tanks that had played such a role in advocating for not just the invasion of Iraq, but the surge, and being these talking heads, always promoting greater military action by the United States in the Middle East, and seeing that there's very little accountability there, but that they absolutely were active. And once again, right now, I believe we are seeing yet another attempt to not just try to erase the role that the lobby played in the invasion of Iraq, but also its role in the war in Iran, when you have the Secretary of State saying that Israel is one of the reasons, when you have Joe Kent saying it was one of the reasons, and when you even have Donald Trump saying that allies in the region are one of the reasons, and that included, and he named it, Israel, that we are engaged in this war. So I think that there's this bizarre quality that when the lobby is at its most effective in pushing the United States to do the things that it has been advocating for years, if not decades, there's nearly in real time, especially now in our modern information age and with social media, an effort to also try to erase those facts as well.
And if you look closely at certain corners, you can see this. Back in the late 70s, you get somebody like Daniel Pipes, who's a semi-important person on the right wing of the lobby, and he was praising Saddam Hussein at that time. Right, how this is the new leader. Now, this is at a time when Israel sees Iran as the problem, and started to see it, and Iraq is not a problem. Then, when Iraq becomes a problem for Israel, people like Pipes shift and call for all-out war against Saddam. So this, you can see that in a certain kind of lag, but a correlation between changes in Israel about which enemy is now our most important one, and what the United States ends up focusing on as its enemy in the Middle East. Those are little historical patterns that you can see that go along with that.
I was going to add, so that Netanyahu, when he went to Congress in 2002, he said, if you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive repercussions on the region.
Well, he also went to the United Nations and a few years ago, a year or so before the Gaza war, and said, I guarantee you that the next time I come here, you're going to be applauding me for all of the good things that have happened in the Middle East as a result of Israeli policy. And everybody, and when he actually did appear the next time, everybody walked out. So just because he makes a guarantee doesn't mean too much in that regard.
I wanted to ask you, Eli, because I know you've covered other aspects of the foreign policy blob as well, like the military-industrial complex, the sort of weapons contractors and how they get in bed with the think tanks. How does this all coalesce? Because I think that multiple things can be true at once. I think there can be Israeli influence. I think you also have the military-industrial complex, and I think you also have Christian Zionists, and they all sort of work together in a weird way to give us, these horrible wars.
Yeah, I think that I mean certainly they have to focus first on the military-industrial complex, or I prefer to call them just the weapons companies, and the so-called blob, which I assume you mean sort of the think tank space, as well as the in Washington. They certainly have interests that are aligned very often, but in alignment with Israel's lobby. Particularly with regards to a lot of that, aid that goes to Israel is spent on American weapon systems, and that no doubt is hugely beneficial and something that Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics would like to see continuing. The war in Gaza, I know when it started that I was listening to earnings calls by weapons companies, where they were talking about that this was going to, give increased heightened demand for particularly their artillery systems. And the analysts were being very cold-blooded in the questions they were asking, saying, so how much upside is this going to produce? And overall instability in the region is something that, again, I keep turning to earnings calls from weapons companies where they will openly talk about the fact that, be it the war in Ukraine and security concerns in Europe, or instability in the Middle East, and concerns by particularly countries aligned with the United States, like Israel and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are going to drive demands for or at least they hope it will drive demands for prestige weapon systems like the F-35, is something that they clearly are all in alignment with. Christian Zionism, I find that to be, as I know, sort of a very interesting topic. One thing I would just point to that's a little interesting here is Israel's lobby has a lot of money that they can at their disposal that they put into our campaign finance system. The weapons companies spend enormous amounts on lobbying. Christian Zionism and the organizations that we associate it with it, like Christians United for Israel, are actually in search of funding and for money. And that's why you see people like the Adelsons, people like Bernie Marcus, people like Paul Singer, giving enormous sums of money, as well as the government of Israel itself, to American Christian Zionist organizations. And one can only speculate about why that is. I think it's partially because they see them as natural allies, but they need resources and to build them up. But there also might be something going on where there's an effort to try to keep them on their side. And that's where you see these recent filings by people filing under the Foreign Agent Registration Act as consultants for the government of Israel, where they are looking to target churches that they believe to be evangelical and Christian Zionists with advertising that is pro-Israel, because there was an explicit concern, and it was laid out in these contracts, about slipping support for Israel among Christian Zionists and evangelicals. And that is an enormous voting bloc. And I think that sets off, all sorts of alarms in Israel, as well as within major donors to Israel's lobby, as well as the institutions here that make up the lobby, when they see that slipping support occurring. So I think they're in sort of a very different league than so-called, Israel's lobby and the donors and the weapons companies. It's not to say the Christian Zionists aren't a part of that lobby, but I think it is potentially a more tenuous relationship, and one that requires the injection not just of money, but of marketing and even sort of propaganda in order to keep this group of people at least nominally on side, because that's an enormous number of voters.
Yeah, there's also this issue where I think sometimes people overemphasize Christian Zionists because they don't, they don't want to be called anti-Semites because they're pointing out the influence of AIPAC, so they say, oh, it's the Christian Zionists.
Right. Yeah, I mean, listen, Christian evangelicals are an enormous voting bloc in this country. But I think that's one reason that, neoconservatives like Irving Kristol made those initial alliances with Christian Zionists and evangelicals, because they knew that in order to be an influential political force in this country, the neoconservatives had to align themselves with a group that represented a significant voting bloc.
I wanted to ask you one thing, Eli, before I forget. I sensed maybe you think that I should be a little bit more precise in my wording, because I use that term, the blob, and I got the impression you think that may not be the best term to use. Am I on the right track there? If so, why? I'm just curious.
Well, I want to get Ian's take on this as well, but I use the blob all the time in conversation. I just always try to make sure when people use it to make sure that we're talking about the same people here, because by its very nature, it is a rather dynamic term to use. But I know Ben Rhodes coined it, and I know it has certainly a specific meaning to him. But I think, as it gets repeated and used by other people, it's important to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Ian, do you want to comment?
Well, it's not a term I use. I was in the government for a while. I've done a lot of consulting for just about every acronym in the national security, intelligence, foreign policy space. And so I have a lot of differentiation in my views of who's there and at what rank and what their loyalties are and what their propensities are. So it's hard for me to see them as a blob. I've also worked with Lockheed Martin in DARPA projects. These are high tech, not weapon systems, but intelligence systems. So I do. It's hard for me to use that term as a precise term. However, I will say something about the foreign policy and security establishment that is true at the higher levels, is less true at the lower levels, that bears on our discussion, although it hasn't come up, and that's the nuclear question. You know, all the talk about Iran's capacity to develop a nuclear weapon usually completely excludes the fact that Israel has one of the most potent nuclear arsenals in the world. And the United States knows this, but can't know it officially, or else would have to cut off aid to Israel. This fact that Israel has this enormous nuclear capacity, that it says that it's putatively developed to deter states that would otherwise not be able to, that might threaten it. It's obviously not relying on that nuclear arsenal, doesn't believe it's of any use, and yet it uses it in a kind of informal, sometimes implicit relationship of blackmail to the United States, because the United States has never wanted Israel to go public with a capacity that the United States failed to prevent it from achieving. But what it has been constrained to do in order to prevent Israel from going public, is to keep its conventional margins so wide that Israel can say, okay, we don't have to use our nuclear deterrent publicly. This is what I'm referencing now is in my discussions within the establishment. That's a topic that causes silence in a room. You can bring this up as much as you want, you will not get an intelligent discussion of it. In fact, you will not get any discussion of it. You won't get a denial of it. You just won't get any discussion. So that's an aspect of it. You can call it the blob, but I would say there's a fact in the establishment that we do not discuss Israeli nuclear capacities, and we leave them out of all discussions about nuclear weapons in the Middle East. That has opened us to this war for this reason. The Iranians have always said that we're perfectly ready to abandon any nuclear program we have that might lead to a nuclear weapon, as long as it's part of a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. It's the Israelis that won't agree to that.
If both of you could, since we just mentioned the nuclear issue, the JCPOA that Obama gave us, the Obama administration, and I would say that was one of his crowning achievements. I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of Obama for other reasons, but I thought the JCPOA was a good deal. But the Israel lobby didn't, and eventually got ripped up, and now we're here all these years later. How important do you think it is, looking at the JCPOA and the ways in which there were lobbying efforts against it?
If I can start this, look, it was Netanyahu who opposed it was the Likud that opposed this. The vast majority of the military experts in Israel and the national security officials favored the JCPOA. They have all been replaced by hacks, by Netanyahu, loyalists. So now you don't have that same resistance to the attack on Iran that all of the previous set of generals and experts that were in the government. So why did Netanyahu, what's behind this? Why did he want a war with Iran instead of a reasonable way to contain or postpone the Iranian program? Because he needs Iran to be this existential enemy in the minds of Israelis in order to justify taking away as their power to attack them eventually. Why does he need to attack them? Because Netanyahu stands for a coalition in Israel, for a position in Israel that's now dominant, that has no plan for peace in the Middle East, none. All they have a plan for is we keep what we have and we use our conventional military capability to mow the lawn every couple of years whenever we need to. That means that Israel has to be able to use military force at will and at almost zero risk of escalation to painful levels. That is what was the problem. The JCPOA did not give Netanyahu the enemy he needed, and it would still preserve Iran as a regional power with its missiles that would help, and with Hezbollah, create an escalation potential that prevented Israel from using its military advantages at will and at no risk.
Just one or two more questions here. I know we're running up against the hour, but I'm curious. I think we've seen a sort of changing of the tide. I mean, recently, Gavin Newsom was calling Israel an apartheid state and even saying, I won't take money from AIPAC and Israeli influence is bad. I think you've also seen a sort of, I don't know what to call it, like a counter-Israel lobby emerging in the past decade or two with organizations like J Street that think AIPAC and some of these other groups are too connected to the Likud party mentality now. What do you make of these emergent trends? Eli, do you want to start with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, Gavin Newsom is always a good indicator of where the popular winds are blowing, because he will, I have no doubt he will change his position on that every few days. But it is useful to look at. I think that it's really important to take all of these pieces that you just outlined as in their totality, which is that this is, yes, there is a shifting of support and a shifting of what is politically acceptable to say, even by elected officials or by people who are thinking of running for office. And in that sense, the floodgates have sort of opened. But this has not corresponded to a really meaningful shift in policy from the United States. And I think that that inconsistency is something that one really has to look at closely, because I think it can be explained only through what has become the lobby's ability to leverage this sort of raw power through money or through other mechanisms to persuade politicians that it would be unwise to change direction, to condition aid, to leverage the aid, to reduce the aid, to stand against Israel's desire to finally have this war, but a war that necessitates dragging the United States in with it. And that space that's being filled with this coercive, I think, power is extremely dangerous. And I think that space is going to get bigger because, as I said, I think earlier in this conversation, I don't think public opinion is going to be going back in any meaningful sense towards being pro-Israel in the way it was even just 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, let alone 5, 10, 15, or 20 years.
Well,
That's not gonna
especially
happen.
with younger people.
Exactly. But how the lobby is going to continue to hold the power that it clearly holds over actual policy, I think is something we need to be watching very closely, because the levels that they will go to hold on to that influence, I'm not sure what the limits are, but we've already seen that it extends to trying to criminalize speech in this country that is critical of a foreign country.
That's a terrific explanation and analysis, Eli. I'd add one thing to highlight it, which is you're moving from a model. Imagine that the NRA had mass support, although it wasn't very well informed, but mass support for its policies. Well, that was the Israel lobby for most of its existence. Now the Israel lobby is becoming like the NRA in that it has tremendous political clout on the careers of politicians, but it does not have mass public opinion support in terms of polling for the policies it upholds. Nevertheless, consider that although public opinion polls show over the years Americans are in favor of banning assault weapons and in all kinds of gun control, we don't get those policies. Well, that's what a lobby can do even without what AIPAC has had. And it can get desperate. And we talk in the book about the last chapter of our book has to do with the implications of desperation on the part of the lobby. So that's the new world that we're in. It's a better world than we were in, but it also has its own dangers and own reasons to be scared.
I was reflecting on the observations that you've made about the NRA, comparing it to AIPAC, and whether AIPAC is on that trajectory, and to kind of bring this into very much into current events and the analysis of the elections last night, which were very mixed in terms of AIPAC's ability to hold influence over these primary elections. One very clear thing that came out of it once again is that AIPAC, while they can funnel money, sometimes in transparent, sometimes in dark ways, into these elections, they are doing it in a transparent manner, we get to see the ads that they're buying that are either supportive of a candidate or attacking them. And the one consistent thing, because they will run any issue that they think they can use to support or to hurt a candidate that is actually of interest to voters, the one thing that they do not talk about is Israel. And I actually would argue that at this point, AIPAC might be less popular than the NRA, because while most Americans may want things like an assault rifle ban, NRA is still capable of talking about, some notion of gun ownership or of hunting or of shooting as being, something that they can try to put in a positive manner that will actually, they think, have some salience with voters or with the public. And I think AIPAC has now reached a point where they actually don't want to talk about their core issue. They'd rather talk about literally anything else. Maybe they'd like to talk about guns.
Real quick, Eli, I also just thought of this, and I wondered your view on it, just as someone that works at Quincy. What do you make of these sort of neocon holdovers like Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol being against the Iran war?
Well,
No, I'm sorry
I
I put you in the hot seat asking, but
I think they've generally fallen into the same category as many Democratic elected officials like Chuck Schumer and others, who are coming out sort of against the war in the context that as a procedural matter they don't think it was handled well, and they think that this could have probably been executed better were it not for Donald Trump. Um, all of those sorts of things, but without ever coming out and saying that, they're kind of the dog that finally caught the car, because in most of their cases, they've spent decades pushing for this war. And the idea that they're now saying, but not like this, is a little bit hard to take seriously.
last thing here, I want to maybe I'll have you guys back on when the book is actually out, but can you preview what's going to be in this book as compared to, say, Mearsheimer and Walt's book on the Israel lobby? How is this book going to offer maybe an updated look at the Israel lobby?
Well, let me take a quick stab at that. If you look at the subtitle of the book, you get the idea. Mearsheimer, John, and Steve, their book was in a tradition of scholarship and articles and books that said, look, the United States policies toward the Middle East are distorted. They're hurting American national interest because Israel and the Israel lobby is dragging the United States away from policies that would serve its national interest better. That was John and Steve made a very good case for a traditional argument. George Ball, for example, and his son made that argument a long time ago. What we are saying is, as a result of changes in the world, changes in Israel, and changes in the United States in the electoral finance laws, the lobby has changed, and it is threatening it doesn't just degrade the quality of American foreign policy, it is threatening American society. It is threatening the freedoms that Americans enjoy, whether that's academic freedom, freedom of expression, and so on. That's why the subtitle talks about not just American foreign policy as influenced by the lobby, but America itself in the grip of the lobby.
Do you want to add to that at all, Eli, or?
No, I would just add to it. As the only thing I would add is that, again, to focus on that subtitle. We're in an era where, for good or bad reasons, there is a heightened awareness, concern, and fear about foreign influence in this country. This has happened in the past, but we are currently in one of those moments, and we certainly went through it with things like Russiagate. There's obviously ongoing efforts to raise concerns about Qatar's influence or China's influence in this country. And I think for the most part, it's good to look at these as and evaluate them at face value for what they are. But if we are going to have this conversation, and I think the public is primed for it, partially because of these pre-existing areas of concern, but also things like the war in Gaza or now the war in Iran. I think people want an explanation for how we got here, and it would simply be inaccurate to look at the events that have transpired without at least trying to evaluate it through the lens of, is this and at least partially explained by some model of foreign influence over American policymakers? And if so, well, what does that mean for our democracy?
Also, real briefly here, because I think there's certain people I've known on the sort of liberal and left end of the political spectrum that are afraid to tackle this topic because they see so many people on the really, really, really far fringes of the right engaging in blatant anti-Semitism. Now, I think you can tackle this topic in a very responsible way. I think Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer did do exactly that. What would you say to liberal and sort of left-minded listeners that are scared of tackling this? I don't know if you want to tackle that first, Eli or Ian.
I'll just quickly say that I think we have a responsibility to tackle it, because if you don't, you simply cede that space to the types of people that you just described, and I think we're seeing that happening right now, because I see Democratic Party pundits coming out and saying that Joe Kent saying that that Israel's responsible for Donald Trump deciding to go into this war with Iran is just a wild conspiracy theory. And the evidence of that is simply that Joe Kent has had affiliations with white nationalists, which is true.
Meanwhile, by the way, it's interesting. Real quick, if I could.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, it's very interesting to me that you have Rachel Maddow running around saying it's everyone but Israel. It's all the Gulf states are behind this.
But when you do that, you cede all of that ground and that conversation into something that is self-evident based on the comments that have been made by Marco Rubio and even those made by Donald Trump, to the folks that you just described who are happy to talk about it in very dangerous ways. So I think we have a responsibility to talk about this and to try to do it in a responsible manner. Ian?
Well, I think one of the crucial things we do in this struggle, which is a struggle against anti-Semitism, because we acknowledge, we say, we warn that there is rising anti-Semitism in the United States. What we do that those hateful groups don't do is we're insistent that the IHRA hoax, which is what we call it, that attempt to blend anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, is what is opening up that problem, which is aggravating that problem. We are the ones who are absolutely defining anti-Semitism as is not criticism of Israel. It's something very different and more dangerous. And we're the ones who are making the argument that's crucial to make if we're going to have a place to defend against that kind of Nazi poison, which we can see in the right wing of the United States, and it is rising, and it is rising among demographic parts of our demography that we don't even like to think about. So from our point of view, we're the ones who are taking the point in protecting our community. We're both part of the American Jewish community from the consequences of Israel and the lobby trying to advance their interests by falsely blending the idea of Israel as a Jewish state with the interests of the Jewish people. That is, Israel is not in that sense a Jewish state, but by saying it's acting in the name of Jews, it opens up Americans to attacks in the United States that are anti-Semitic. And we are the ones, we believe, who are fighting the fight that's most important against that. And we will lean into that issue. We are not going to apologize for saying things which rhyme with arguments made by people we detest. We insist on being able to speak truthfully, even though those are uncomfortable truths said in language that is hard for many people to hear.
Just to add to that, I promise to let you go after this, but just to add to that, I think too, if you're concerned about money in politics and the influence of lobbies, whether it's the NRA or whether it's some big corporation that's cozying up to Trump, whether it's like the Ellisons or whatever, the Israel lobby is no different than any of that. If you are concerned about the influence of money in politics, you have to factor the Israel lobby into that. Could you give me your thoughts on that, Eli, real quick?
I mean, absolutely, and you already sort of laid it out. The Ellisons are clearly part of that. So, Larry Ellison's the biggest donor to Friends of the IDF, and made it very clear that in their pursuit of and certainly Benjamin Netanyahu has about his enthusiasm about Oracle's role in the ownership and control of TikTok. That clearly that's an effort to try to shape speech amongst young people who are increasingly critical of Israel's actions and of the U.S.-Israel relationship. But yes, I think you simply cannot talk about campaign finance in this country without talking about this topic. I think there's been a lot of either honest or dishonest reasons that people have not had that conversation. I think a big one was there was an anticipation with Citizens United that it was going to open the floodgates of corporate money and that it would have an undue influence of corporate influence in our elections. It's not that didn't happen to some degree, but the largest donors in our political system are individuals. People like the Adelsons, people like Bernie Marcus, people like like Paul Singer. And these are people, and Reid Hoffman and Jan Koum, and these are people who are very clear about their motivations for giving their money, and I think we should believe them when they say who they are.
Ian, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, that's just fine.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming on Parallax Views. Thanks for staying a few minutes over the hour. I really appreciate it. How can my listeners keep up with your work?
They can send me their email address. I'll put them on my distribution list. That's one way to do it. My email address, ilustic@gmail.com.
They can check me out on X for the website formerly known as Twitter at Eli Clifton. And I hope you can put out the pre-order links for our book, which is open for pre-order on various booksellers right now.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff. It's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.